Jó estét and hello everyone, this is How to Become a Grandmaster. I'm Denes Boros and today we're going to do something unusual. Usually I take a look at people who become Grandmasters and how did they become Grandmasters, but this time it's going to be different. This time it's going to be the pupil and the coach himself. Now, the person of interest in this topic is Vincent Keymer, or Keymer. Keymer, thank you. Keymer, and he is one of the newest 2700 players. Now, there have been a big boom in chess, especially in India, with Gukesh, Pragnananda, and many others joining the high ranks and reaching 2700 plus. But Europe used to be the one carrying the torch, and the newest edition of a 2700 is Vincent Keymer, and he, of course, is coached by none other than the legendary Hungarian World Championship challenger Peter Leko. So we are going to start off with a couple of his games and then transition to Vincent's game. Now, Leko is very well known for his subtle, slow-moving style, kind of like an anaconda. So we're going to actually see that in action in these couple of games. So this is Leko short, e4. Now, how times are changing. e4 used to be exquisitely the only move played on top level and was the most popular move. But since then, as you're going to see in Vincent's game, he will not play one e4, which was very popular. I mean, for many reasons, but mostly because of Bobby Fischer. So e4, e5, topical at those times in the 90s and the late 90s, but still kind of the hype today. e4, e5, the most solid approach you can have. Knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5. And this is actually the critical move. There have been people mouse slipping and play the Italian, but all the OGs of the chess world know that the Spanish is the big and more aggressive way of playing, as you are putting some pressure on the e5 pawn. a6, bishop a4, knight f6, castles, rook e1, d6. Now, Leko is very well known to be a big theoretician. Even in those days, they thought that he knows a lot. So here Nigel Short avoids his pet Marshall, which of course happens after b5, bishop b3, castles, and has been debated since with pretty good results for black. In fact, Magnus Carlsen defended his title based on the Marshall Gambit versus Karyakin. So Short goes for d6, and this is the first moment I am going to stop and ask the chat and everyone on YouTube what you think about this position. Now, d6 of course is not a mistake, although a sideline. It over defends the e5 pawn. However, it does allow a couple of ideas for white. Now, whenever you look at a position, you should always look first at potential threats by your opponent. So, what could we sense? What sort of danger might be lurking in this position for white? How to become a grandmaster? Study, study, study. I mean, it's also good to look at a lecture or participate in a lecture. If you participate, you may not get the answers right, but at least you try. Leko was the GOAT of his time. Yeah, he was very close to becoming a world champion, and in fact, narrowly missed out of becoming a world champion himself. Yeah, the threat over here is going b5, bishop b3, and knight a5. Now, when Nigel short plays d6. It's a very, very normal move, but it does allow something that wouldn't happen and wouldn't work otherwise. So b5, bishop b3, knight a5 is a threat, and in that case our bishop would be trapped over there. The problem with that, and just to demonstrate, h3, b5, knight a5, the bishop gets trapped and you really don't get too much for it. You mostly are just down the bishop pair. So White's goal in this position is either to avoid that or somehow take advantage of the fact that Black did not commit with the idea of pawn to b5. And here Leko's choice is somewhat surprising. On the other hand, not at all a bad choice. He decides to take on c6. And taking on c6 may look weird. I mean, you might be asking, well, didn't you tell me that we're supposed to keep the bishop? Well, he exchanges this bishop for the reason that it will lead to a doubled pawn on this side of the board. And he's going to take advantage of that. Goes d4 and tries to undermine the center. Note that Nigel's king is still on e8 and is actually prone to be attacked if he's not careful. So let's say if captures, c5 would be unfortunate, knight c6, and already there are some threats around Black's king, and of course the queen is under attack immediately. Now Nigel avoids that, plays knight to d7. So there is actually a famous talk and a conversation between Yasser Seiravan and Viktor Korchnoi. Yasser famously asked, well, isn't that pawn a weakness? And Korchnoi replied, well, it's only a weakness if you are able to attack it. So our goal in this position is A, to find a way to get close to the c-pawn, or B, to create more weaknesses in Short's position. Because for the moment, Black is holding up perfectly well. He has the bishops. There's no sign of those pawns falling ever so quickly. So our goal should be to somehow sort of either improve our situation or B, try to create even more weaknesses in Black's camp. How could we go about that? And again, to refer back to a chat message there, of course, studying is very important, but using your own brain and trying to figure out a position, and in fact, just providing your own 2 cents of what you're thinking about the position is very important. The worst thing you can do is sort of rely on anything else. You are supposed to find a way of getting closer, try to get close to solution in the position. It may not be correct, but at least trying is the first step. So we already mentioned the c-pawn is potentially the big target in the position. How could we get close to that one? You could take on e5 and get the knight to c4. Very good, Simon, very good idea. You are creating a weakness on e5, and as that pawn can't move away because it's fixed by my e-pawn, you will have the time to go knight d2, knight c4. You wouldn't want to go knight d2 immediately, because if Black castles, knight c4, I can capture on d4, takes, I will just defend this pawn, and Black is more or less fine. Although it's still kind of awkward, but probably c5 still works. So d takes c5 is a very smart choice there. Just fixing the pawn on a bad square and then go after the pawn on e5. But we still haven't had an idea how to go after the c pawn. So knight e2 and going captures knight c4, that's great. But how could we go after the c pawn? We still haven't really figured that one out. A lot of times it's good to sort of gather ideas in a position. It doesn't mean that you're going to play them, but in the back of your mind, it's good to know what you're aiming for. You can go queen e2 and queen c4, exactly. You can go that way. You can also go c3, queen a4. Although, whenever you push your pawn, you can never go backwards, which is of course a problem. But of course queen e2, queen c4 makes sense as well. So Peter takes on e5, takes b3. So we looked at around 2 plans, but he comes up with a third. So we talked about knight d2, knight c4, talked about queen e2, queen c4. We haven't really thought about this move of b3. Now, every position is about a balance. Even though black has a doubled pawn and weak pawns at that, and a weak pawn on e5, black has a trump card. What is that trump card in black's position that makes this whole setup viable for short? What could it be? Well, it's the bishop pair. Black has the bishop pair, so this move of pawn to b3 actually responds to that. Leko is not in a rush to go after those pawns. He says those pawns are going to stay there and you'll be able to go after them. But at this very moment, I may just be able to go bishop a3, trade off one of your bishops, you lose the compensation, and you are just saddled with those pawns on c6, c7, and e5. Castles, bishop a3. Very nice little move. Trading off that active, well, not so active bishop, but it actually may come active if you don't pay attention to it. Like after bishop c5, that bishop is pretty good. So Leko circumvents that, goes for bishop a3. f6, queen d3. So he managed to go after the bishop on e7, and he's combining two ideas. He's trading the bishops, and he's targeting the c-pawn. I see grandmasters analyze positions in terms of ideas, but practically one needs consideration of different candidate moves and exact calculation. What kind of training might help with that skill? So this is sort of that. You are supposed to try to understand a position on your own, come to your own conclusions, and then compare. That's how you actually improve as a chess player. May it be if you're an international master to a grandmaster, or a FIDE master to an international master. It really doesn't matter. We're all working with the same positions, but if you're using the right techniques, you should be able to improve your chess game. So here Leko sort of answered the long strategical problem of black having the bishop pair, and only now he went for the exact calculation of going for the c-pawn. King h8, queen c3. And today's chess players mostly think about calculating. And calculating is important, but here, in fact, the long-term problems and the long-term ideas are more of the core importance in this position. So the fact that black is going to have to defend those pawns forever, because it's very unlikely you'll be able to trade it off, because I will be always there to guard that square, means that white's advantage is guaranteed till the end of time, till the end of this chess game. And for that, you don't need to calculate, you just need to understand the position. And one of those things that Leko does extremely well is understanding the core concepts in a chess position. Today's chess player isn't as good at understanding core concepts as they're good at calculating and making sure what they're looking at is perfect, or what calculations they had are to the point. So bishop b7, knight d2. So we see these moves, but let's try to make sense of it. Why do you think Leko decides to go and play knight f to d2 instead of the b1 knight, apart from the apparent reason of trying to defend that bishop? Of course, that's one of the reasons, but, you know, let's expect a little bit more from Peter Leko. And we, of course, expect more from him. He definitely has more reasons than that. I mean, we're kind of doing that, Bishvas. We're trying to take a look at why Leko makes the moves he does, why he goes knight f to d2 when our natural idea would be just to develop the pieces, especially because our rook on a1 is cramped on that square. Why would Leko do that? And for you to understand a higher level of chess, or a good level of understanding, or Leko's chess in general, you have to ask these questions. Hello. So there are a couple of key squares in this position. One of them is the c4 square, but that's not the only one. Chess is sort of about balances. Leko can sort of predict what short is attempting to do. What short is attempting to do is to capture, go queen e7, and just try to activate his pieces. So it would make no sense to capture on e7, because in that case, you're actually improving and giving an extra tempo for short. Why king h8, bishop b7 over c5? Let me go back there. So there is the simple reason that queen d5 check wins the rook. So c5 doesn't really work now. I just pick up the rook. And if you go bishop b7, you're always in danger of getting checked. And in fact, white can use that with this move of rook to d1. And if the knight moves away, then I have queen c4 check. And then you're struggling because you didn't hit your king in due time. So king h8 is a super grandmaster prophylactic move, making sure that the king is tucked away and there is no sign of danger. So queen c3, bishop b7. And the reason why Leko doesn't go knight d2 here is because if you take knight d2, black actually manages to reroute his pieces accordingly. So what do you think is the plan here for short that he would like to do? Also, Paul, thank you for your message. There are plenty of pieces that are awkward. The b7 bishop and the knight on d7 is very, very awkward. However, you may notice that this trade actually facilitates one specific idea in this position that black cannot do in any other case. Yeah, it's the plan of knight to c5, knight e6, and once this knight gets to e6, the idea of pushing the c5 pawn actually gains strength. You could go c5, but then you're sort of denying your own knight on d7. You really don't have more than just an active bishop. You would want to combine those two, so you'd go knight to c5. Let's say white gets this juicy outpost on c4. And then black could go something like knight d6, c5, controlling the d4 square and activating the bishop. I'm not saying that there are no problems, like here knight a5 still looks very, very, very nice for white. However, it still gives a glimmer of hope for short to consolidate. So it goes knight f to d2, and you might see that after it captures, you are the one helping me develop, because even though knight is on the side, it will land on an outpost shortly. It's going to land there, it's going to be very comfortable, and I already actually made a useful move. It might be able to go to e3 and even to f5 later on. And to f5. Let me get my arrows straightened. And you actually lost the tempo there. So you can go c5, but then again, you're kind of denying your knight a good square, and this knight is going to be really, really bad. Also, white can also go knight a5, putting pressure on the bishop. So he goes rook b8, knight c4. And now again, we're sort of having this slow maneuvering tug of war. White isn't going to grant any easy squares for the queen. He says, well, if you want to do something, you may want to capture here and help me develop. If you don't do it, if you, let's say, play c5 again, well, that will mean that you will have two bad pieces. So oftentimes it's not really about improving your own pieces, but about actually denying your opponent good piece play. Bishop a8, and that by in itself is not a happy move. Knight d2, takes, queen e7. So you may sense that black actually had to spend extra moves till he could get his queen to e7. Meanwhile, Leko gained a lot of time. Queen a5. All right. So it's time for us to evaluate the position. Who do you think is better? What do you think will be our long-term plan as Peter Leko? I mean, I did give some subtle hints, but it's okay to use them up. If you listen, you're just benefiting from that. Ideally, fix the c6 pawn. Okay, but how would you go about it? So it's great whenever we have an idea of what we want to achieve, but it has to materialize somehow. Paul is saying, I think it's safe to say that white is better, has more active knights over the stranded bishop, and will attack on the queen side. Yeah, this bishop on a8 is mummified over there on that square. It really can go out, and if you push the pawn, it may even become weaker. We've got this beautiful outpost on c4. However, truth be told, we're still not in a position to attack the c6 pawn. I'm a little bit surprised that none of you really mentioned that the a6 pawn is hanging. I mean, we can't really take it yet, but once we get the knight on c4, it's going to become a real threat. And that's something that short will have to take care of, not to mention the c7 pawn. So this move by Leko, even though for the moment it's a ghost threat, because the knight on a3 is a little loose, but once he gets the knight to c4, these become real. You can also get your knight to e3, exactly, and you can also get and go to f5 afterwards. So knight c5, over defending. So now you may have noticed I wasn't wrong. Nigel is trying to get his knight to the juiciest squares out there. And one of those other things that modern players sometimes overlook, the center squares are still the golden squares you may go after. So like the d4 square is that useful one because it already hits on c2 and it sort of restricts white's play. Goes knight c4, bishop b7, over defending. But it's not a happy move. I mean, Short isn't making these moves of back and forth because he's enjoying it. Queen a3, another little nasty pin. You can't move the knight. You don't have time to go there. I just take your queen. Rook e8, rook d1, knight e6. All right, the big question. Should we trade that queen or not? And these are big questions. Anytime you get a position of power, so you're the one calling the shots, that doesn't necessarily mean you don't have to make decisions. Just right now, you have to decide whether a trade would favor us or not. And of course, it always has an upside and a downside. So what do we think? Does this have more upside to it or more downside? The queen might be an important piece for our strategy. We should prefer keeping it. Okay. I like the queen trade since the minor pieces are still around to attack the weak pawns. Okay. All right, so let's say we trade. What would be the ideal spots for the knights that we have? What is the ideal scenario here? Because yes, our knight on c4 is beautiful, but the knight on d2 is sort of helpless and it really doesn't do too much. Well, c5 we can't really do because that is actually controlled by black. Well, yes, exactly. So the other knight may eventually get to f5, and then we found two beautiful outposts for our knights. They're all working. It's a beautiful work environment over there. Both knights has a job to do. And the other thing is, if we move our queen, well, black would just continue on with his plan of rolling with c5 and knight d4. I'm not saying that moving the queen is necessarily bad. However, there is a natural flow to the position. So queen e7 is very logical. And if you know Peter Leko, you know that he actually likes these technical positions. Knight f1. And what actually Leko does very well is harmony. Most of his pieces are well harmonizing. King g8, knight e3, going for knight f5, king f8, rook d2. So this is a threat, but he also wants to take control of the only open file that you can have. c5, f3, over defending the structure. If our knight eventually gets to f5, then how can we judge the consequences of a potential g6 push? Okay, so we are in consensus here that white is better. However, to win a chess game, you will either need to win material or create weaknesses in black's position. So let's say I go knight f5, I provoke g6, we actually created a weakness in the position. Black already had two weaknesses on c7 and c5. Very hard to get to, but this is a third weakness. The rule of thumb is if there are two weaknesses, there's a good chance of winning. Three, well, sign me up. That's great news. So here what we're going to see from Leko is that he's going to slowly squeeze this position. where he clearly has the advantage, but it's not winning just yet. Rook d8, rook takes, rook d1. So he's always quick to trade off short's good pieces. Knight e6, knight a5, again, already pressing that defender. Because if this bishop is gone, I will have full control over the d5 square. Bishop a8, knight f5, f7, king f2. So one move forwards and one improving the position. Again, one move forward, improving the position. King e8, c3, g6, knight e3. And sometimes we only concentrate on our own moves, but it's actually a mistake. Chess is a game for two players. Your opponent is obliged to make a move. So oftentimes it's much worse to react. g6 here, I feel, might be more detrimental to short's position than not making any pawn moves at all. h5, king e1, h4. So he's trying to clamp down Leko's king side. However, that h pawn may even become a weakness in the long term. Knight c4, knight b2, knight a4 incoming. We'll see. So knight g4, and this is the reason why h5, h4 is not necessarily a great move, because you do not have this move of h5 anymore kicking out the knight. So making aggressive moves may be useful if you're playing against an aggressive opening, because you have to punish it somehow, let's say the dragon or the Naidorf. But in a subtle endgame like this, pushing the pawns forwards aggressively may actually backfire. And in this case, now this knight cannot be removed. It's an unmovable force that's very difficult to reckon with. King f8, king f2, g3. So Leko is actually taking advantage of the fact that the h-pawn is weak and may actually use the h-file to his own advantage. Takes 6, rook e7, king e3, not yet at least, rook d2, knight f2. So he's slowly improving the position. He didn't go knight c4, knight b2, knight a4, but he found another way. And he's actually going for knight e3, knight g4, knight f2, and he's going for knight d3 and attacking it that way. He may even have some time to go that direction, but what you should notice in these positions is that these threats sometimes force the opponent to make an unforced error, because it's very difficult just to wait and see and just watch your opponent actually circle around your weaknesses. f7, knight d3. Very, very subtle and beautiful technical play by Leko. Rook d7, a3. Preparing an eventual b4-2, b4. Takes, takes, king g7. So you might be wondering, well, wait a second. Didn't you tell me that the c5 pawn is going to be a weakness? Well, yes. But Leko decides that in the long run, the a pawn is going to be a much easier target to latch onto, because you will have this idea of rook a2, knight to b3, and knight to c5. I'm going to go after the a pawn and just conjure it up. And it's much easier to attack it than to attack the c5 pawn. Also, this method of attack, what Leko is using, creates less weaknesses in his camp, so there is no room for counterplay. If you go knight c4, knight b2, knight a4, you are actually loosening your grip on the position. So Leko is trying to keep the grip on the position, making sure that Nigel doesn't have any sort of counterplay, and then he can go after the a pawn without any problems. Okay, 2. Knight b3. And just as I said, he's lining up on and against the a pawn. Knight c5. And it's basically winning the pawn because it's a double attack. So one of the key pieces whenever you're trying to better your chess is to aim for double attacks. Now, whenever you're starting out your journey as a beginner, it's much more difficult, but if you practice them, if you practice the tactics of attacking two pieces at the same time, or pieces and pawns, I tell you honestly, oftentimes they win you material. And it's the case here as well. Bishop c8. Now, of course, if you take, that doesn't change the situation, because Leko has another knight that will double attack. You may be able to defend the bishop, but in that case, I'm just winning the a6 pawn. I would have never thought to trade away the c5 pawn, says Paul. That's some high-level stuff. Yes, this is very much in Peter Leko's style. He likes playing and sort of restricting the counterplay of his opponent. And this is actually very much in the old style of Capablanca and many other legends. Takes, and rook a6, and that gives the advantage. But bishop c8 was played, knight takes a6. So the reason why Short goes for bishop c8, he's trying to keep up some pieces on the board so he can use them later on and get some play. That's why he goes for f5, and that's already desperation, and it leaves the e pawn weak. Knight c5. Again, Leko is not tempted to go for any free pawns. He just makes sure that Short's pieces are still bottled up. Takes, pawn takes, bishop g4, knight d3. Again, cutting off this rook. Rook e8, rook a7, rook e7, b5, c4. Slowly pushing the extra pawn, and it's almost game over. Knight b4, and Short resigned because there is really no way of avoiding that knight d5 successfully. Even if you go bishop e6, there's plentiful ways of winning. You can push the b pawn, but even knight d5 leads to a winning rook and pawn ending, where just too many pawns that Short cannot deal with. So very, very beautiful technical game by Leko. Now I do want to show one more Leko brilliancy and one from Keymer. So let's take a look. This one is Peter Leko versus Pinter. Pinter, if you don't know him, he's been a Hungarian champion, a very, very strong player in his own right. So this is actually going to be a big fight. e4, e5, not surprising, even in the 90s, e4, e5 was a solid choice. I mean, even earlier than that, e4, e5 was all the hype. Bishop b5, obviously the best move. He plays the Spanish. Bishop e7, b5, d6. Just plays the slower version. c3, cancels, h3. So if you would go d4, which is the most natural choice, Black can go bishop g4 and just pin the knight. And this is theoretically not supposed to be that much of a big deal for White. The position is balanced. So Leko goes for h3, takes away that move, and prepares d4. And of course, this is one of the big main lines of the Spanish. Knight d7. Knight d7 isn't really popular these days, but has been a line played by prominent players in the past. d4, bishop f6. So Black's main plan is to over-defend the e5 pawn. However, that comes at a price of the knight on d7 being rather awkward, because it does not really do too much apart from defending that square. Now, this knight on d7, apart from being bad, it also blocks off that bishop on c8. Now, if you've been watching the Magnus Tour recently, you may have noticed that many players at that top level actually kind of try to force their opponents to get a bishop like that, because it can't really contribute too much to the game, and oftentimes Black will have to waste time to actually get it to a better spot. All right, so this might be the first time you see this position. What do you think would make some sense as white to play here? So very unusual play by black, but by in itself that doesn't mean that it's necessarily bad. Unusual could be good. However, we know some basic Spanish principles and we may actually be able to use them. Bishop e3 makes sense, and in fact that responds to black's only idea of pressing the d4 pawn. Right now, knight d2 does not work for that very reason, because you could go after that. g4, well, there is actually a rule of thumb, and that's the rule of the guardian pawns. You are not supposed to move pawns in front of your king. H-pawn, sometimes you can, but pushing the pawn straight in front of your king is something frowned upon on the top level of chess because it can devastatingly weaken your king. So don't touch that pawn. It's there to defend your king. There's a reason they're called the guardian pawns. So there is a principle in the Spanish where you know that there's some weaknesses in the position you can go after. And that is the b5 and a6 pawns. That is correct. a4 is the typical idea, and it also indirectly presses the a8 rook. So it not only puts pressure on the weak pawn, it also creates some tactical threats. So naturally, Leko opts for that move. a4 is a great move. It's a typical one. On the other hand, I see nothing wrong with bishop to e3. That's definitely a move that you can consider here. a4, knight a5, bishop c2. Now, on principle, you might get already somewhat suspicious of black's play. Even though black often plays this way, the knight is on the rim, and it's not looking good there. And this other knight on d7 don't look good either. So black is already getting into some hot waters. Bishop b7, d5. Now there is an old rule. Whenever black goes bishop to b7, d5 is a great move because it basically mummifies the bishop on b7, and it really isn't able to exert any sort of pressure. The only way that black can try to somehow do a Houdini act is to go with c6. However, if you move that pawn, that square on d6 is going to get loose and the d pawn may just fall. AB by in itself isn't going to change anything because the rook is defending the a5 knight. White knight a5, well, black is trying to avoid this a takes b5 threat and also freeing the c pawn for some further action. Bishop b7, d5, bishop e7. So Pinter is making sure that the d pawn is overprotected. So let's take a look at this position. So far, very logical play by Leko and logical play by chat. All props to chat. Well done. What can we do here? How can we continue on with our plans? It's all about understanding concepts, regardless of your level. And it's the same thing here as well. Queen e2 makes sense. You can go knight d2, knight f1, knight g3, queen e2. But I'll give you a little bit of a hint here. Once you embark on a plan, you should always try to go through with it. Make sure you follow it up, because if you don't do it, that's when you can't really learn from your own play, because you're combining too many ideas at the same time. And just to jog your memory, we were trying to undermine the a6 b5 pawn chain. So we should follow up with that. In fact, Leko goes knight a3. Not your usual move. By today's standard, a typical move at that, but he follows the rule of not moving the queen out too early. Therefore, the early morning rule, you don't want to wake her up too early. She might get grumpy on you. Now, queen e2, queen d3, the issue is that if you move it early, you actually just find yourself in trouble. It's going to become an easier target. That's why most of the grandmasters and super grandmasters of our time wait with that and rather facilitate development for the light pieces. May it be knight to d2, knight f1, knight g3, or knight to a3. Now, knight to a3 looks like a weird move. However, it has its point. It keeps on piling on the b5 pawn. Make sure that Pinter is busy defending it, and also keeps this diag open for the bishop. Because whenever you go knight d2, you will have to patiently wait for that knight to move away, and then you can develop the dark squared one over there. So knight a3, c6, b4, knight c4. And so far, so good. Leko has been following his plan very beautifully. However, this is the time for a reckoning. What should we do now? And just a disclaimer, this is more of a strategical position. So don't expect like fireworks and checkmate, even though it does happen in the Spanish, but this is more of the strategical side of chess. In fact, the whole variation, the whole Spanish variation, is all about maneuvering and slow playing the game. It's not your typical Sicilian where it's just pushing pawns and then just mating. No, this is the old, good old Café La Regens. We're gonna shuffle a little bit, and maybe we'll do a little dance if we win. If we don't win, we don't do no dances. So if you can get or create a weakness in Pinter's position, that's already going to be a win. Very good. Very good, Paul. Captures and capturing on c6. And I really like Leko's move ordering. We don't really talk about that a ton, but it's very important. Because if you take on c6, there are occasions where they can capture a piece instead. However, knight takes c4 is a strong move here because it actually forces Pinter's hand. He has to capture back. D takes, and now we have to take a look at this position and what Leko achieved. He actually got a majority on the queen side, so that is already a plus. Leko has a hope to create a passed pawn, and that can convert into an advantage. Apart from that, there is a c4 pawn weakness in the position. So he has a majority, a c4 pawn weakness, and another weakness on d6, and that means that Leko is already making some headway. Knight d2, d5. And d5, even though feels like the right move, it creates more weaknesses. in the fact that this bishop on d5 is undefended. So this was sort of the strategical part. And once your opponent pieces become loose, basically pieces that don't have anyone guarding them, that's the moment when tactics starts to work. So knight f3, immediately double attacking on e5 and d5. And that's actually the beauty of the game, that you can actually do double attacks. But you can only start having double attacks once your position is in a good standing, or in other words, you're better. Bishop f3, so this one is practically forcing Pinter to capture on f3, but now you already get the bishop pair too. So Leko is sort of accumulating the advantages now. Queen c7, a5, fixing that weakness. Very beautiful strategic play. King h8, bishop a4. Pressing that knight and sort of pinpointing that the e-pawn is still very weak. Rook c8, queen d5. Direct play on the knight on d7. Rook d8, queen c6. He says, well, you have problems on e5. You've got problems on c4. You'll have problems on a6. I'm ready to liquidate into a queenless endgame. Takes. Knight b8, f5. f5 is a desperation, but Pinter still makes a very good choice here. He says, well, if I wait around, slowly my position is going to collapse. So I may as well just muddy waters. Takes, bishop f6, rook takes f5, but Leko doesn't mind. He takes it. He takes the challenge. Rook e8, rook takes f6. So this is the other part of the story. Even though Leko is not very well known for making tactical decisions, in some cases he is more than willing to go that extra mile and be more tactical. Rook e1 check, g takes. And now it all seems to fall apart, right? Because Leko's rook on a1 is pinned by that rook on the e1 square. So the big question is if there is some way for us to untangle as Peter Leko. Bishop g5, exactly. A beautiful little tactical shot by Leko. It doesn't really matter if you take on a1. I have bishop takes f6, and I will win your rook. Goes here. Well, if you take here, I just capture. Here, I capture. And because my bishops are so strong and this knight is just too passive, white has just an overwhelming position. Rook e6, rook e1. So now it's a cascade of tactics in this position. Rook d6, takes, bishop f4. So Leko does not mind the trades. His position is superior. He has the better pieces. Knight d7, bishop d5, rook e2, bishop c4. Oh no, rook e4. Oh no, there goes the bishop. But did Leko have something in mind in this case? Or is he just going to resign? To quote classics, pause, then champ. It looks like it's game over. Bishop d3. Bishop d3, rook takes f4, and now the unbelievable thing happens, king to g3, and black is up a whole rook, but it's captured on the middle of the board. Can't go anywhere. Anywhere you go, anywhere you try to go, I follow. Every step you take, every move you make, I'm going to capture you. So knight e5, takes, king e4, and what is most important in a pawn ending? Well, it's king activity. And the knight is pretty much helpless as Leko kings marches in to the center, activating it, and it's game over. A beautiful display of positional understanding and tactical prowess by the World Championship challenger. Beautiful game by Leko. But I wanted to show a game that his student Vincent played, who actually became 2700 just recently. So let's take a look at this one, where Vincent Keymer is facing Arkadij Naiditsch, who's a strong player in his own right. And not surprisingly, they opt for a very, very tactical and aggressive game. This is the King's Indian, so we are expected a fight. d6, knight f3, c6. And c6 is sort of a choice just to avoid theory. Castles is what I would expect, but it goes for e4. a6, castles, b5. And whenever you think about Vincent, you sort of expect the same thing that I told you about Leko. Very subtle, positional, doesn't really want aggression necessarily. However, there are cases when he takes his chances. What do you think we can do in this case, in this position?
Yeah, no one does. Welcome in, Ken West.
Hey, hello.
How are you?
Feeling good? So in this position, Black slow played on this side of the board. And really the question is if Vincent should go aggressive. Obviously he should, but if he does, how could he do it?
White to move.
Yeah, white to move. Exactly. e5, indeed. e5 is a very, very strong move, and it just shows that even though Vincent follows more of the principled slow-moving chess, if time comes, he goes for the most principled and aggressive move in the position. Here, it's actually very strong because it opens up this long diagonal, and even though some of his pieces are solidly placed, it is still looking kind of dire for Black immediately. So Black decides to go knight e8. c5. Another very, very strong move by Vincent, fixing the weakness on c6. Bishop g4, c takes, e takes, bishop f4. All very principled, following the logic here, making sure this rook will be able to join the attack later on. D takes, knight d7. And Vincent's next move is quite beautiful, because it feels that Black is sort of having some fun and some pressure, because there is this pin on the queen on d1, and also the e5 pawn is sort of feeling loose now. However, Vincent actually finds a solution very much reminiscent of Leko's display versus Pinter.
Knight e2.
Well, knight d2 is a little bit too solid. What we're looking for here as white is something more drastic. Surprising, but more drastic, by all means. a4. So we have to keep in mind that our e5 pawn is under heavy fire. So a4, by all intents and purposes, is aggressive, which is good. But you want to and you should actually act in the center. See ya, Cruzo. e6. e6, which looks like something out of a different planet. You should just see Ken West. Grandmaster Ken West is astounded. e6 is actually a beautiful, beautiful pawn sacrifice because it is sort of made on positional grounds. It isn't that he's winning and he's going to get material back. But here, black captured back with the pawn, but if bishop takes, then there's knight to d4. And of course, you must take here, but then it's just toast because you're dead on the dark squares. But if you don't, I'm just going to take on c6, and with this garage sale of pieces, you are unlikely to survive. So e6 is a beautiful move, sort of loosening up black's position and getting rid of a target that Naiditsch was after. F takes e6, h3, bishop h5, and here again, Vincent plays a beautiful one, which is great and also more of a strategic move because black is still putting up some pressure. Note the pin and note that maybe the long run e5 could be an idea. So Keymer's next move is going to actually just solve that problem. If you go queen to b3, then there is knight c5 jump. So that actually doesn't really work that well. So he plays the very funny looking queen e1, which is the most awkward looking move that you could make, but here it's actually very good. Not only do you step out of this spin, you're also getting this rook involved, and you're targeting the e6 pawn. And what Vincent is doing right now is sort of keeping Naiditsch's pieces back on the 7th and 8th and not giving him extra tempies. That's why queen e1 is such a great move, because it creates a threat, avoids some threats of black's, and it kind of prepares this rook to get developed. Note that everything white did was sort of, and in some ways, developing his pieces. Captures on e6, bishop f3, g5, rook d1. And it almost works for black, because these bishops, like bishop can't move because the f3 bishop is hanging, but tactics actually comes and helps Keymer. gf, rook takes, queen f6. All right, the big question time. Should we trade the ladies or not? Now, in order to make a good judgment call, you should always count them pieces. That's the most important thing here. If you don't count them pieces, you don't know what you're missing. So Cruzo is saying, not if we attack. It's not always about attacks. It's always about material. It's not that you decide, okay, I'm going to attack. It's about the demands of the position. And I think that's a big and grave misunderstanding. People decide, oh, I've been attacking for like 15 moves. It must be a mating attack. That's not how it's done. If the position depends and it wants you to go and slow play it, you may as well slow play it. He slow plays it. He says, well, according to my humble count, I've got an extra pawn. You got an extra pawn, trades are good. Takes, rook c8, bishop b7. He's gaining a little bit of time, while Naiditsch is desperately looking for some counterplay. Rook c7, do we trade? Do we trade?
Double it up.
We don't trade just yet. We just double the rook. So a lot of times it's difficult to tell what you ought to be looking for. But in this case, the best idea you may want to do is, A, can I trade? Is that beneficial to my position? Or can I strengthen my position? Now, rook d1 in this case is pretty good because it strengthens the position and it keeps black's knight back on e8. Takes, b4. Now note, if you take here, you can capture here first, takes, and I'm up an extra pawn. And that's good enough, at least on Grandmaster levels. b4, knight a4. So once you get the extra material, your goal is to over-defend your position. Knight a4 actually makes sure the b2 is well guarded. Even this move of rook fd1 made sure that all of white's pieces are well defended. And again, the important thing, g3 pawn is weak. Well, it's only weak if you can attack it. You can't attack it, so it's not really that weak. a5, king g2, and yeah, that tractor on d7 is steamrolling the 7th rank. It's actually putting a lot of pressure on black's position. Takes, knight f6, rook d2. Now this actually sort of resembles his coach, his trainer's play. Just making sure everything's over defended. I have the advantage. I don't have to go for one more pawn and just let you get some counterplay. h5, knight c5. Now this knight wasn't doing anything anymore, so it comes closer and it may actually join the fray on the king side. Rook e8, that actually cuts that off. Bishop f3. So as he can't jump around there, he's actually setting up ideas of knight b7 as well. h4, g4. Keeps the healthy extra pawn, and if you can actually set up a protected passed pawn, you should, and so does Vincent. Rook e5, check, knight d3. Again, doesn't go for adventures. Also, by now the rook was defending it. Goes knight d3. Rook d6, rook d7, bishop e4 check. And again, notice that, yes, he goes for more strategy, but in this case, he still uses some tactics. Of course, this bishop is taboo because I just capture on d7. King h6, rook a6. Now he goes after that. And again, uses the fact that the knight cannot capture. Rook d4, bishop f5, over defending. So he's not trying to abuse these tactics. He's trying to incrementally improve his position with every little step. King f3, bishop e4, rook b5. Of course, he'd be okay with the trade now because the king comes closer to the center. Rook b5, bishop c6, and again, the knight is denying some crucial squares, and so is the rook. Have to move, captures, check, check. The game is technically over. g5, but still note that he is making sure that there are no counterplay for black. g5 is actually creating a little safe space for the king in case of a rook e3 check. King g4, king f5, everything well guarded, and now the king is in trouble. Rook b5, rook d5, king g4, takes, check, king f5, king g6, knight d5, the knight is coming. k5, king g6, again, tactics. This is mate. And another move. check, knight f6, and here black resigned because king h8, there's mate here, and if you go king f8, then rook f7 is checkmate. So I really hope you enjoyed this one on how to become a grandmaster between these players. So we've been talking about Leko, who is the coach, and Vincent Keymer, who is his pupil, and actually hit 2,700 just recently. So I really hope you enjoyed your time over here. We looked at that. I am going to sign off here. Hope to see you guys again in the future. Thank you so much for watching and being here.
Yeah, we'll be on Twitch in a few months too.
And we'll be on Twitch later, yes.